The sales have gone flat for Dove soap. About 10 years ago, they hired a brand new advertising agency because how excited can you get about a bar of white soap? And they realized that sales had gone flat and they had to do something. And so there they were. They had hired a new firm, and they were all sitting around their great, the great table, and most of them are men. Most of them are men deciding about how to advertise beauty to women. That's a different homily. I won't even go there. But they were expecting this advertising agency to come in with charts and graphs, and that they would sit back and in a cool and manner that they would dispassionately make decisions about the new advertising campaign. And instead, what happened was that the advertising firm came in and they showed video. What the men didn't know is that they had gone to the daughters of every man in the room, and they had videoed their daughters talking about their bodies, their body image, and the beauty industry that they were a part of. And so they sat there, and onto the screen came one of the daughters of one of the men sitting there, and she began to talk about how she hated this about herself, and she hated this about herself, and she hated this about her body. And it got quiet. And then the next girl came up, the girl of another man sitting around the table, and she began to talk about, and every daughter of every man in the room, they saw them talk about how they hated parts of their bodies. They wished they could change this. They hated this. And they talked about how they resented the advertising industry that used digitally manipulated images of women that told them they had to live up to a standard that no woman could live up to, some sort of an ideal look. And they talked about how they resented the cosmetics industry, and they talked about how, as their fathers looked at their daughters, they all talked about how their self-worth and their confidence was chipped away by the advertising industry that held up an ideal that they could never attain. Yeah, this is what it sounded like in that room. It went silent. It went silent. And those crusty old, let's call them crusty old decision makers who were used to just sitting back and looking at charts and making cool, dispassionate decisions, they did what nobody would have thought was possible. They scrapped millions of dollars worth of old advertising, the whole approach to advertising that used idealized images of women that they could never, and girls, young women, that they could never attain to. They scrapped a whole advertising industry that had made them millions of dollars, millions and millions of dollars for decades. And they scrapped it all, and they took up an advertising campaign in which they admitted their guilt in harming the images of women and their own daughters. Now, there are two kinds of freedom. There's what theologians call essential freedom, and then there's effective freedom. I'm essentially free I'm totally free to speak Russian. But effectively, I can't speak a word. I only know one word in Russian, da. And effectively, I can't speak any Russian because I haven't done the work that it takes in order to speak it. So there's a freedom that is an essential freedom. And that's the freedom that St. Paul is talking about in our gospel. Essential freedom is the freedom to choose to be the kind of person that I'm going to be. Essential freedom is the freedom that those executives around that table, they had the freedom to choose to become the father that they were going to be. They had the freedom to choose to become the dad to their daughters that they were going to be. They had that essential freedom to decide to make themselves to be the kind of person they were going to be by the decisions that they made. And that, once they got in touch with their essential freedom of who they were going to be as a father to their daughters, that set free their other kind of freedom that could make the decisions about this detail and this detail and this detail and this detail. But they had to get in touch with an essential freedom first of all. And that's what those incredible videos did for them. In our second reading, St. Paul is trying to do the same thing, exactly the same thing for us. He's telling us, you are baptized. You're the baptized people who are baptized into a baptismal life. Don't you know you're dead? Don't you know that in baptism you died? You died. Something stays in the pool. Something stays in the baptismal water. Some part of you died. And then when you came up out of the pool, you were raised to a newness of life with Christ. And what died was an old you. What died was the part of ourselves that is so susceptible to being fooled by the glamour of beauty, the part of ourselves that allows ourselves to be mastered by sin. He's saying that part of you died. The part that was raised up in baptism then is the part that is alive to Christ. And we are to think of ourselves. He does that amazing thing at the end of the reading. He says, think of yourselves as dead to sin and alive to Christ. There is a part of us that we must continually think about as dead. And that puts us in touch with that essential freedom that says, I have the freedom to choose to be the kind of person I'm going to be. The kind of father I'm going to be to my daughters. The kind of mother I'm going to be to my children. The kind of person I'm going to be in this world. I can make my life my first work of art, and I can make the decisions that make me to be the person I am going to be. And then I will have greater resources to deal with the other decisions of freedom in my life. And so that's, of course, what we do at Mass. Baptism is not simply an initial thing of being dunked in water. Baptism, that's the beginning of a baptismal journey. And the baptismal journey is being born into a freedom in which God sets our freedom free. That's what baptism does. It sets our freedom free so that then we have the freedom to choose to be the kind of people we're going to be. And so, Jesus in our gospel, though, baptism is the beginning. The water is the beginning. It's the beginning of being, what we're baptized into is a community of people, and we're baptized into the church, and that means we're baptized into a baptismal journey of constantly coming back into the people of God and to hear the word of God and to receive strength from the Eucharist so that we can get back in touch, so that we can plug back into the essential freedom to choose to be a baptized person of God, to choose to be a person who loves God and loves Jesus Christ. And that then can set free, that can then expand the freedoms of our lives, the other freedoms of our lives. But we have to keep getting in touch with the essential freedom to be, the essential freedom to choose to be who we're going to be. And that's the baptismal life. It starts at the baptismal font, but it's a whole life. It's a whole lifetime of the church making present to us the grace of that baptism, that there is a person who died there. I am to consider that person, that sinful person, dead, and now I'm alive to God. Well, that sounds all really lovely, and that sounds, but in our gospel, Jesus makes us aware of another dimension. Freedom, human freedom, is very complicated. And so Jesus makes us aware in the gospel of another dimension of that freedom. There's a cross in the freedom. Because there's especially a cross if we think of freedom in the American way as a multitude of choices. The more choices I have about everything, the more free I am. That's the American version of freedom. That's not the Christian version of freedom. The Christian version of freedom is my freedom has been set free to become a good person. It's not so, but the American version of freedom is, well, if I have, instead of 10 choices of which cereal to get in the morning, I have 15 or 20, then I'm more free because I've got more choices. And instead of having, 500 channels on my video, I've got 1,000. Well, then I'm more free because I have more choices. And the American version of freedom is just more choices, more choices, more choices. But then how much of our lives do we waste flipping through the channels to find something we want to see? How much of our lives do we waste on meaningless choices that don't really have much to do with anything, who we're going to be, or what kind of life we're going to live? That's not the Christian version of. There's a cross then in the freedom that God calls us to. If we choose to be a certain kind of person, that means we won't be able to choose a whole lot of other things. We won't have the freedom to choose a lot. We won't have the freedom to watch anything we want online. We won't have the freedom to choose certain kinds of friends. We won't have this freedom to choose to spend our money certain ways. There's a lot of freedom of that multitude of little choices. We won't have that if we're free to choose to be the kind of people we want to be in God. It will limit some of those freedoms. There is a cross to the freedom of the children of God. But Jesus, what St. Paul is trying to tell us in our gospel is that part of you died. Think of it as dead. And think of yourself as alive in God, as being given the gift of the freedom, the essential freedom to choose who you're going to be in this world. That's the great freedom of the children of God. Get in touch with that freedom, and it will expand the freedom of your choices about everything else, about the freedom of your choices, the true, real freedom about the other choices of your life. So let us come to the altar then. Who are we called to be? Let us come to the altar and tap into that essential freedom of the sons and the daughters of God who feel the call of God to become a certain kind of person. And let us receive from the resources of God's grace, the resources of God's mercy, the freedom to make the decisions we need to make to become the person God calls us to be.